Welcome to the latest episode of Leverage. I have my very dear friend, Howie Paskowitz, who's agreed to join me today. Aside from being my neighbor for many years, our kids growing up together, and I believe my husband and you used to have sandwich making contests. He's not here to talk about any of that, but we are here to talk about the rental market. I'm not going to steal your thunder. What is your official title?
I am the Executive Director of Development at Starlight Investments.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad I didn't have to do that.
If Eddie is thinking of doing sandwich podcasts, I'd love to be on
that
one.
Would actually be a really good one.
I think it could be a lot of fun.
I think, when you have those podcast hosts and they're like, we have a guest host this week. We're going to do that one week where you and him could talk about how you use. I used to bring everything out. By the way, we're getting to rental market. I'd bring everything out onto the table and then the two of you be really quiet. I would always not be able to go into work the next day because I had eaten too much. But that's right. And then you'd be like, the two of you like, do we do a second?
Yes. Well, you'd see something he was doing that I wasn't doing. And it's, you sort of want to keeping up with the Joneses.
Fair enough.
Isn't that what drives the real estate market? I mean, back to real estate.
Yeah. And then there was always a good football throw down the street as well.
Yes.
Howie is originally from Buffalo. We've had many very good talks about the Bills now that they're good.
Yes,
I used to make fun
not
of him
always.
because I am a Patriots fan and now we suck and you're great. So there you go. Who knew that I would ever have season tickets?
Wow. That's what's kept me liking you. I hate to admit it now in public, but it's what kept us together.
So now that everybody knows about our sandwich history.
Yes.
Since you have such a macher position, I thought you'd be the perfect person to bring on. But we have actually talked recently about some of the projects that you're working on. I've seen some stuff that you put out on Twitter. And the reality is that Canada as a whole, but specifically Toronto, has experienced and is experiencing a housing crisis. And that is across the board. I mean, I talk to my buyers every single day about the fact that there's no inventory, talking about affordability, and also rentals. There are no rentals. The rentals that are available are expensive or they're old. So maybe kind of chat with us about like what you're doing right now, what you do, what you oversee, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. So at Starlight, we work primarily on the sites that we already have. So we're the largest provider of rental housing across Canada. So rather than looking for pure development play sites, we try to find opportunities on our existing sites. So infill development up the block from you at Bathurst and Brookdale, we're adding 24 family-sized townhouses on what used to be a parking lot at the back of an existing apartment building. We've got another project near Bathurst and Finch, also townhouses. We have mid-rise, high-rise. That's our primary focus. It's adding new rental housing. And for the most part, if you already have an existing apartment building there, it's a decent location. It's a decent place. You already have the infrastructure in place for managing it. So my job starts when we first look at acquiring a new site, or maybe it's reviewing an existing site we've had for a while, and it's seeing, okay, we've got this empty piece of land, or we've got an extra parking lot, or whatever the case may be. How do we extract more value out of that site, but how do we add more housing? And how do we make sure we're not displacing too many people or creating too much of a interruption to people's daily lives, that we can add more housing?
And out of curiosity, why the focus on like not a piece of vacant land, for example? Or is there just not enough of it? Or
probably two aspects of that. I think land is, we probably all know it's as they say, God's not making any more of it, so buy what you can. Land is getting very expensive, and I think the development approvals process and the construction process, I think, and we'll get into maybe why that is, but it could take 5-6 years before you acquire a site and actually start bringing in the income. So for us, that 5-6 year carry is a long period of time. We'd rather take what we already own and get it going already. So the property is carrying itself with the rental income, and we're finding ways to add more rental units and more rental income.
Because I can't imagine what your vacancy rate, for example, is. I'm sure across the board is.
I think vacancy rates are probably 1 or less. I mean, especially with rents the way they are through the roof these days, people are not moving out. Turnover is quite down. I mean, I'm jumping all over the place on some important topics,
sure.
But where I was before, I was somewhere else for 18 years, a family business. They were buying greenfield sites, and they sort of had that long-term view. It was a family-owned business. Starlight, because you've got partners and investors, the patient money isn't as plentiful as opposed to, we'll buy an existing apartment site and we'll cover the cost of getting the approvals and the construction, but they're not necessarily going to sink it into sort of vacant sites. So I think it depends on, just like a condo guy, who needs to get the money in and get the money out, I think even developers looking at an existing apartment site is a very different beast than a greenfield site or a brand new location that's just sitting empty.
For sure. And I speak to builders, developers that I know, and the challenges in, just breaking ground, just, the fees. We talked about, I use the analogy of, you go to the pump and you fill your car up and it's $1.52 or whatever it was yesterday, it makes you like nauseous, and like $1.10 of that is going to the government. And so, and I speak, this is my jury of one, not yours, but my biggest challenge is, and I have lots of clients who are really challenged in affordability and looking for housing and saying, they hear about, some kind of like, non-tax savings fund or something like that. And there's this kind of soapbox that, whether it's at the municipal level, the city level, it doesn't matter, where governments are saying, we're all about housing because it's a housing crisis. But at the end of the day, condos are expensive because it costs condo developers a great amount of money. I mean, I had Brookview on the other day, Greystone on the other day, and they were talking about, they look to build average cost per, square foot of a condo. Would they like to do it less? Yes, but they can't. And so, is it kind of a little bit like we're doing all these things to try to help add extra housing, but on the back end, are they making it even harder, like for developers? And that might be a hard answer for you to give. I'm just
going to move my phone, which is vibrating through the chair. I'll put it in my pocket.
That's okay.
I agree with the cliche of growth needs to pay for growth, right? So when we pay $50,000 in development charges to the City of Toronto for a unit, I'm not going to say that every dollar of that is money well spent, but I understand that if I'm introducing new users to the ambulance and to the fire and to the sewers and the roads, we've got to pay for that, right? I think
fair. It's a very good point.
I think there's some elements there that make sense. I question the federal government saying housing's a big deal, and yet there's still HST on new construction, and it's a lot of money. And I think it would be a real easy, quick fix. And I think also you have to look at if you start to charge too much tax on something, people won't buy that.
Like land transfer tax?
Like land transfer tax. People won't sell their houses. And so, people see development incentives and they go, why do the developers need more money? Well, if the pro forma doesn't work, we're not going to go forward. So you could say that...
We don't work for free.
No, we don't work for free, and we have to make money, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. And I think, there's a few sort of, really long-term people that can sort of not make money for 10 years and it's so worthwhile to them. But a lot of people don't work that way. So development charges are really big. In some municipalities, they are out of control and through the roof. And I think, part of the problem, and maybe part of the root of the problem in why there isn't real dialogue between municipalities and the governments and developers is developers are seen as sort of these evil, money-hungry,
landlords.
Yeah, like the financialization of housing. And it's interesting to me because, I've been to many public meetings and people get up and they say, we know you're building this just to make money. And I would love to say back to this, mob, that grocery store on the corner where you get all your groceries, I'm sure you think they're doing it because they want you to have food. They're doing it to make money. And
that's also a hot topic right now.
It's which again, and I get it, but if it's, if you start capping things and penalizing people for making money, and it's very weird because we say we want housing for everyone, yet somehow if the people providing housing are making too much money, they're the bad guys.
No, I think it's a really good point. I think that So, and by the way, just wait for the comments on this podcast. No, but from people who, have a hard time out there. And I appreciate their feedback, and I appreciate, that landlords are greedy or whatever, because there is a perspective out there. And I do. And by the way, I think there are developers that don't do it in the right way. I think there are landlords that are greedy, but I think that, even, so we were talking about this a little bit, you have a landlord that has an old building. Okay, so you have an old building, and it's rent controlled. You can only go. I think 2023 was 2.5%. You could raise your rent.
I think that is the cap.
That's what I'm saying.
I think even that was we know inflation is not 2.5% right now.
Right. So we know. Which, by the way, okay, great. It made it more affordable. By the way, 2.5% is a lot for some people to even fork out. No question. So I appreciate that, but they're protected. So, but then those people are saying, well, my apartment's falling apart. And they don't realize that there's no incentive whatsoever for the landlord to update that building. Zero. Because they move you. Then they have to put you back in the exact same rent after spending all the money to renovate it, and they have to find you a place to live. And when you look at the dollar and cents, it's not worth it. Like, I have a client who, as soon as someone moves out, they renovate it, they upgrade it, and then they increase the rent. Fair. They need to make money. But, the people who are living in the unit next to them are saying, well, how come they have a nicer unit? Well, the dollars and cents make more sense.
It's a tough one because it would be great if every apartment in the city can get, modern finishes every 3 to 4 years, fix it up. It's just, unfortunately, it's just not possible, right? Like, we're not replacing people's cars. Honda is not calling the guy that bought the Civic 12 years ago and saying it's time for a new one for no cost. So and it's tricky, and I get it, and I get why the government has these sort of restrictions in place. But I think what happens is the rules are structured to go after the lowest common denominator.
Well, always, for sure.
So, but the problem, and then you take, the attitude that it's the greedy developer. So when we add a brand new apartment building next to an existing apartment building, the city's official plan has a requirement that you take, the requirements to extend the life of the existing apartment building. Right? They're the idea being that I think 20 years ago, when landlords were like, oh, wait, I can go get approvals, but they weren't taking care of the existing building. So the city said, we're not giving these slumlords the ability to add more buildings if they're not taking care of their existing ones. Okay. We want them to spend money. Okay. So I'm going through dealing with that now, where the housing guys are saying, we expect you to put another $1 million into the existing building if we're going to give you approval here. And I show them that, well, since we bought the building, we put $5-6 million into this.
Right. It's not like you haven't kept yes, for sure.
Whether it's a new amenity space or whether it's a new lobby, new elevators. Now, there's a flip side. There's a return there. I'm going to get higher rents from the incoming tenants because it's a nice looking building. Mm-hmm. But there's still this assumption that we're bad actors. And I think, and that comes, but there's also, at some point, we've created a system that it seems like the city, and I don't want to point fingers specifically, is protecting people from themselves. So what do I mean by that? So we've got a new rental building. We're hopefully going to get approval on next month. We've got, because of the wedding cake of the angular planes and all that stuff, we had 2 suites that had really nice big patios. Really gorgeous, and I'm sure we would have gotten higher rents. And someone at Urban Design said, that's too much space for just 2 people. You need to make that into a community amenity space for the residents of the building, right? So this idea that we live in a society that they can tell us those patios are too big for individual people.
They can't have it.
They can't have that, and
even if they're willing to pay for it.
They've taken on this responsibility. Like, they need to be. I don't know what if it's. I don't want to call it the word communism, but it's this idea that we're going to tell you what to build because we know better than you, and I think what that does is, now in that case, I had to pay my architect to draw up a plan to demonstrate why it would be impossible to do that, because then you'd have to put an exit, and then you have to put stairs, and then you'd lose the unit. Yeah. We got the answer we wanted, sort of. We're actually pulling back the size of the patio and adding in a green roof at the edge. Now, green roof is very nice. I love it. But the person living there would have loved that extra 10, 15, 20 feet, whatever the case is. But here is sort of the approach that planning has taken, which is, we don't trust you, and you know, whether that's, you know, telling us the minimum size of units, right? And we talk about the fact that people need housing. I think more than anything, what I've seen is people are desperate. And
Yes.
we are in a housing crisis, and it became very clear. We have a very good mutual friend who moved to Vancouver a few years ago. He's a surgeon. He's doing very well. It took them 5 years to be able to afford a house out there. At least 5
Crazy.
years.
Very successful surgeon.
Very successful, sir, and it's very scary. And I said, you know, I think Vancouver's only a couple years ahead of where we're going to be
They're
very
about
soon.
5 years. We're about 5 years behind them.
And our kids, and I worry, and I think what drives me at what I do is not just, you know, I enjoy doing it. I have 4 kids, and I truly wonder how they will afford to be able to live here. And I know I'm not in, you know, in the lower end of the demographic, and so here we are talking about the need for housing, and yet you've got time and money being wasted on, you know, that patio's too big, or, you know, I don't want you. If you can make that like the answer is always if you can make it smaller, right? We had another issue that we wanted to sort of speed up the process a little bit, and someone who's pretty high up in planning was like, you know, maybe drop 2 units. You know, it's 2 townhouses in Scarborough, rental townhouses in Scarborough, family-sized housing, and the answer was, can you make it smaller? And so it's...
But why? Because they wanted you to put more units, or they just didn't think it was...
They thought whatever
acceptable?
problem they would have with getting this approved gets less if we have less housing. So how did we get to this point where
What?
It's hard to understand.
But it really is amazing. And I think like it's kind of those revelations. I don't know if like with my oldest daughter, if you have this, where they get exposed to something, you know, that's very adult like this. And they're like, but that doesn't make any sense. And I'll always just say, welcome to adulthood. Because there is so much that doesn't make sense. I mean, and here, so I think, you know, as you're talking, you're explaining all of this to me, you know, I think to myself, how responsible of your company? Because I know the project that you're working on around the corner from me very, very well. And I saw the development in the initial building. So it's really interesting you say that. Now I see that you changed the balconies and in the exterior. And there was definitely work that went into that. And now I understand why, or maybe it was already in the plans. But you have a parking lot that you probably could have charged money for parking. You could have not built anything on it. You could have said, you know what, I'm just going to raise the park. I might just not have it go with it. Whatever it was, you said, how could I potentially help the housing crisis and build more properties? Meanwhile, you've got, condo buildings that are going up that investors are buying, which, by the way, we also talked about this, so there's also that whole controversy about the fact that, all these investors are coming in and they're buying up condo building units and they're not allowing, the average person to go and buy a condo themselves. They're jacking the prices up. Well, those people, and by the way, I'm not going to comment on that. It's another episode, but they're also creating rental units. Yes. But the difference is those rental units are built. What was the year that you could, after, if it was built after that year?
It keeps changing. I think now any new buildings after 2017.
Okay. Doesn't have to go along with the 2.5%. I mean, they can raise the rates of your rental unit however way they like.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
No, I think so. It's interesting to me. I think that it's both. I think, first of all, if I was renting, I'd be terrified to live in one of those places. Because first of all, market is really hot. You know what? The owner society is going to sell. Now I'm out. And I told that to people. Like, they're looking for a rental, someone who gets referred to me. And I'll say to them, you have 2 choices. Really, like, you are taking a chance with someone who's got a condo. You have to move in 3 years. That person might have bought it. They made a good amount of money, but not enough money to do it on assignment. They're going to hold on to it for a couple of years. I go and live on Bathurst at Fairlawn. I can be there for the rest of my life.
And only pay, the worst is 2.5% increase each year.
Right. So I think that it's interesting that, that there's so much pressure on you guys. Meanwhile, there's all this over here, and it's like the wild, wild west. And they're very expensive.
They're very expensive. Listen, new units are going to be expensive, right? I don't think we can, but I think it's okay to allow for the fact that we have shared, whether it's us and the government or the city or the homeowners that are, coming out and screaming because they hate it, right? And the system is flawed in that we have created a world, and again, I'm all for democracy, But these city officials, these city officials, they're reapplying for their job every 4 years. Right? They need to run again. And so I just came from something this morning where someone who's in the middle of an election said, the project's great, but I can't support it because I might lose some votes. It's not a great way to do it. And I think at some point we need to say, the politicians are beholden to the people that live nearby and they don't want change. And so until the system changes, I'm not sure how you get the change in the structure. I don't know how you get,
it's the loudest voice. It's the smallest minority with the largest voice that is causing something.
And that's who comes out. And that's who comes out and makes noise and says, someone's going to park on my street and we can't have that. And so, there's a lot of, I guess, maybe just not understanding the way the system works, that these people, they come out and they scream and it causes delays, and delays are money. And, it's tough to just build housing. We just want to provide more housing. Obviously, we have a financial incentive to do it, or we wouldn't do it. But I think that's okay, right? I think that, in a free market, the best outcome is when you're providing services or goods that people need and you're doing it because you have a financial incentive. And that's okay. I don't think there's too many things that we benefit from on a daily basis that aren't there because, we need to make the money. And, back to the development charges and the fees, I'm happy to pay money for transit. We want good transit. I'm happy to pay money for schools and for ambulances and sewers. And I think, I think it's okay that we have those there, but at some point it became so easy to just, let's take the money from the developers because they're making so much money anyway. And now we are where we are, where people can't afford a house. They can't afford to rent. I don't know where my kids are going to live. And you're creating these, these ugly things that you're building because of all these sort of city planning rules. And I wish it was easier, but it's not. But we keep doing it.
What would you say is the biggest demand? Where do you see, yes, rentals, fine. But what are you seeing as is it 3-bedroom? Is it whole families? Where have you seen that kind of shift? I mean, you've been doing this a long time. I feel and this is jury of one, but I think about when I was a kid, I think of someone who's living in a rental, they were younger, single, is the first, and now the reality is that, and I've said this many times, it's like your kids, I stress my children out, right? They're I'm never going to own home. We're breeding a generation of renters. I mean, and I will say this, it's not all doom and gloom. I do believe Toronto is only coming into its own. I think if you look around the world, people can't afford to live in New York. They can't afford to live in Paris. They can't afford to live in London. Major metropolitan cities around the world are very, very expensive. Is it fair? No. Should everybody be allowed to have a huge house? Of course, in a utopia. Just the reality is not. And so that's why you have people, we have friends also who live in New Jersey, although they could afford to live in New York. But I mean, a lot of people live in the outskirts of these major cities because of affordability. And I think we're just going through those growing pains for sure. But now that and I do believe we are, especially now there's in front of City Council, the opportunity of having up to 4 rental units on your property.
Yeah, they passed it.
Did they pass it?
It's passed, yeah. Wow. I'm sure there's going to be details they need to work out. It was a real...
That's huge. That's huge because you don't need... Do I have to beep any?
It was a real shit show at council last week, but it went through.
Wow.
Yeah, 4.
You heard it here first. Although this is going to be aired 2 weeks from now. That's fine. But I mean, you don't need committee of adjustments. You don't your neighbor can now have 4 rental units on the property, which by the way, again, you said to me, good or bad? I think there's good and bad in that. And it depends on the area and it depends on, and it will depend on, the people who are living in that area. I'm going to just say it the people who live in the lower village are not going to be so happy that they're next door. But some places in the East End and West End that have higher densities may be easier to go about. But that's very interesting.
It is. So that you said there's a lot there in what you said, and I think it starts with it was a Mississauga city councillor that said we've been selling dreams we can no longer afford. Right, the idea of making it in Toronto or Canada is your 50-foot lot, your lots of land, your own place.
We're accidental millionaires. Our generation are accidental millionaires. That is the reality. None of us thought.
No, and it's that's not sort of, it's not achievable. And I think I'd like to say maybe it's okay it's not achievable. Most people in New York City do not own their own home. And
they're not upset about it.
No, and they're okay. And there's something about, you know, you lock the door, you go away for a few months at a time, someone else worries about it. And that's kind of okay. What we need to remember is if we price everyone out of the city, who's going to run the services? And so I did some work on the West Coast, and I had some interesting sort of changes of heart of people there. So I had a project in North Vancouver that originally was turned down by council, and I went back out to try to save it. And a few of the councillors, obviously someone had been talking to them behind closed doors, because they all use the same analogy about that person who's making my $6.50 cappuccino at 6 a.m., they're not going to be able to afford to live in North Vancouver anymore, which is a very affluent place. Yeah. And if I'm working at Tim Hortons making $15 an hour or 16 or whatever it is, and I'm living in the city and I'm paying $2,000 a month, or I can move an hour or two away and I can pay half of that, well, where am I going to go? And then the next big thing that happened, if you remember, I think it was floods, a lot of the bridges in the Vancouver area got cut off. And all of a sudden everyone woke up and said, the nurses, the firemen, the paramedics, they can't afford to live here, and we're creating. Wow. And now, who's going to come save us? So I think there's a shift in that it's okay to create rentals for people. It's okay. It's not the bottom end of the barrel living in rental apartments. It's the next generation that can't afford to get their house, and that's okay. 1/3 of immigrants to Canada come to the GTA.
And they usually purchase a home within the first 5 years. That's the stats.
They probably do. But when they first get here, if you want them to come here, and we want that skilled labor, right? And we want people to work on construction sites, we need to have those rental apartments. So I think the mindset is shifting. So I've been doing rentals now since 1999, 2000. I'd get up in front of a room of people and talk about doing rentals, and they would lose it, right? No, we want condo. We want townhouses. We don't want those kind of people. The mindset is shifting.
That's horrible.
But that's what it was. But listen, when we got our first house, you know, we had people saying, you know, oh, don't live where we live, right? Because we were not that far from certain neighborhoods, right? It's really changed. I did an affordable housing building next to a market building, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, will people rent in the market building if it's next door to an affordable housing building? Having
said that, I do want to defend what the summer that we bought our house, there was the shooting. So, but I think that, again, going back to the fact that we live in a metropolitan city, we used to live in a nice, quiet little city that people like patted on its head, and we now have big city problems. That's it. We have big city problems.
And that's okay. Yeah. Either you want to be a world-class city, or you want to live somewhere out in the suburbs, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the one time I always feel sympathetic to anyone that, you know, comes out and sort of speaks out against the developments I'm working on, and I get it. Sometimes what they say is completely idiotic, and they're morons, and they're just NIMBYs, and they don't want any change because, heaven forbid, they hear a shovel, or whatever the case is. There was one guy that lived out in Whitby, almost in the middle of nowhere, and we were putting a subdivision across the street, and he said, I moved out here because I never thought there'd be housing here, and I don't want the disruption. Now, the truth is we had to reroute trucks, and it cost money because of this guy and whatever, but, you know, I don't know if you heard the name Adam Brown, great real estate lawyer, municipal lawyer, one of the top guys in the city, and he said he has no sympathy for anyone that bought on the first block in from a major arterial street in this city that says, what do you mean? I can't believe you're putting up a tower on my corner. Unless you bought a house 30 years ago in Toronto, you have to assume that someone's going to find a way to add more.
I say to clients now, like anywhere that they're close to, I'm like, that will be a condo. I don't care. There could be a church, there could be a synagogue, it doesn't matter what it is. Everywhere you go, and you can start looking for this now while you're out there. If you drive down a street and you see like an older building, a detached, it doesn't matter, a parking lot, there is a notice sign on it. Yeah. And that's okay. Yes, it's okay. But I'm saying that's blown up for sure.
It's blown up, but if we want to have people that can afford to live here and provide the services that we're benefiting from on a daily basis, whether that's my cappuccino or my nurse or a teacher.
No, valued. Everyone is valued for
We need to do that. I'm not even going to get into the environmental aspects of not having people commute, you know, an hour, 2 hours.
We'll have you back to talk about it.
Listen, ESG is a real thing. I can't say that 10 years ago I really would have thought that it was going to be taking over the world. Now before we do anything, it's all about the ESG stuff. Anyway, I don't want to switch topics.
We will
save that. Bring Eddie and sandwiches.
I was just
ESG.
going to say, I'm going to thank you so much for being with us today. I feel like we could talk. I mean, we didn't even get into the Buffalo Bills and the NFC East. But on that note, we will not put your name down or your contact information for anybody to call you on your opinions. I'm just joking. But maybe we'll have Eddie and you guys can do an episode of Leverage just about sandwich making. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, Hal.
Thank you.